Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 9. Drinking, Heresy, Pirates, and Beavers. Rule number 7 right out the gates. Historiography is important and is never stagnant. What does this word, which sounds like so many other words, and yet is so difficult to say, mean? By Wikipedia standards, historiography is the study of the methods of historians in developing history as an academic discipline, and by extension is any body of historical work on a subject. The historiography of a specific topic covers how historians have studied that topic using sources, techniques, and theoretical approaches. This is a fancy way of saying that the lenses of history are all different as we value things differently over time. An ancient Greek historian like Herodotus will interpret data and culture much different than someone more contemporary like Howard Zinn. All voices are important, but we need to remember who and why these voices are talking. Think of all the people over time that could have contributed to historical thought that just never learned to read or write. This is a huge missing demographic we take for granted. Also, things like the internet have revolutionized how we collect data and record history, a far cry from the archaic days of parchment and scrolls. Currently, the battle lines of history are drawn in the sand with traditional and revisionist history. As we have seen in the other rules, history can easily be manipulated for political gains. But the term revisionist seems silly when you investigate our historiography. We aren't changing the history, we are merely reshaping how we view the history. I'll bore you later with the tedious speech of Confederate statues, which I assume you already have a preconceived notion about. Jamestown. Jamestown is one of the most famous American colonies. It is perhaps because of how well it has been documented. In 1607, 104 Englishmen and boys arrived in North America to start a settlement. On May 13, they picked Jamestown, Virginia, for their settlement named after their king, James I. The settlement became the first permanent English settlement in North America. Jamestown's site was picked for several reasons, all of which met the criteria the Virginia Company, who founded the settlement, said to follow in selecting a spot for the colony. The site was surrounded by water on 3 sides. It was not entirely an island yet, and was far inland. Both meant it was easily defensible against possible Spanish attacks. The water was so deep enough that the English could tie their ships at the shoreline. It's great for parking. The site was also not inhabited by the native population. Once the spot was chosen, the Virginia Company's instructions, with the list of council members selected by officials in England, was read. The names were kept in a sealed box on the ship. The first president of the new Virginia colony was to be Edward Maria Winfield. The other 6 council members were Bartholomew Gosnold, Christopher Newport, John Martin, John Radcliffe, George Kendall, and John Smith. By June 15, the fort was completed. It was triangle-shaped with a bulwark at each corner, holding 4 or 5 pieces of artillery. The settlers were now protected against any attacks from the local Powhatan Indians, whose hunting land they were living on. Relations had been mixed between the newcomers and the Powhatan Indians. On June 22nd, Captain Newport left for England to get more supplies for the new settlement. Not long after Captain Newport left, the settlers began to succumb to a variety of diseases. They were drinking water from the salty or slimy river, which is one of the several things that caused the deaths of many. The death tolls were high. They were dying from swelling, fluxes, fevers, by famine, and by sometimes war. Food was running low, even though then Chief Powhatan started sending food gifts to help the English. It was not the Powhatan Indians' help in the early years. The settlement would most likely have failed, as the English would have died from various diseases or just simply starved. By late 1609, the Powhatan Indians and the English had soured as the English were demanding too much food during a drought. That winter of 1609 to 1610 was known as the starving time. During that winter, the English were afraid to leave the fort due to a legitimate fear of being killed by the Powhatan Indians. As a result, they ate anything they could. Various animals, leather from their shoes and belts, and sometimes fellow settlers that had already died. By early 1610, most of the settlers, 80 to 90%, had been killed due to starvation and disease. By May 1610, shipwrecked immigrants who had been stranded in Bermuda finally arrived at Jamestown. Part of a fleet sent the previous fall, the survivors used 2 boats built on Bermuda to get to Jamestown. Sir Thomas Gates, the newly named governor, found Jamestown in shambles, with the palisades of the fort torn down, gates off their hinges, and food stores running low. The decision was made to abandon the settlement. Less than a day after leaving, however, Gates and those with him, including the survivors of the starving time, were met by news of an incoming fleet. The fleet was bringing the new governor for life, Lord Delaware. Gates and his party returned to Jamestown. In 1612, John Rolfe, one of the many shipwrecked in Bermuda, helped turn the settlement into a profitable venture. He introduced a new strain of tobacco from seeds he brought from elsewhere. Tobacco became the long-awaited cash crop for the Virginia Company, who wanted to make money off their Jamestown investment. On July 30, 1619, a newly appointed governor, Yeardley, called for the first representation in legislative assembly. This was the beginning of the representative government in which is now the United States of America. In that time, the first documented Africans were brought to Virginia. They added they needed human resources for labor-intensive tobacco. In 1619, the Virginia Company recruited and shipped over about 90 women to become wives and started families in Virginia, something they needed to establish a permanent colony. Peace between the Powhatan Indians and the English, brought about by Pocahontas' conversion and marriage to John Rolfe in 1614, ended in 1622. In March of that year, the paramount chief planned a coordinated attack against the English settlements. He was tired of the English encroachment on Powhatan lands. Jamestown escaped being attacked due to a warning from Powhatan boy living with the English. During the attack, 350 to 400 of the 1,200 settlers were killed. After the attack, Powhatan Indians withdrew, as was their way, and waited for the English to learn their lesson or pack up and leave. Once the English regrouped, they retaliated. There was fighting between the two people for 10 years until a tenuous peace was reached in 1632. On May 24, 1624, the Virginia Company's charter was revoked by King James I due to the overwhelming financial problems in politics. Virginia became a royal company, which it remained until the Revolutionary War. This shift in control did not change the English policy towards the Powhatan Indians. Despite peace declared in 1632, English encroachments on Powhatan lands continued undiminished as more settlers arrived in the colony. Filipinos have been in the territories that would have been the U.S. since the 16th century. In 1635, an East Indian is listed in Jamestown, Virginia. A 2003 study reveals that Captain George Menifee, who was assigned 1,200 acres of land in Jamestown in 1624, used Tony, an East Indian, as a headwright. Menifee, a wealthy English merchant, obtained legal rights to the land by paying passage for 24 immigrants, including an Indian. Anne Hutchinson. Though religious tolerance is a tenet of the New World, it is hardly without events to the contrary. Anne Hutchinson was born in 1591 in Lincolnshire, England. Her father, Francis Marbury, was a Puritan minister who insisted his daughter learn to read. In 1578, Marbury was tried for heresy by the church after making repeated critical comments and was jailed for 2 years. He was again prosecuted for criticizing the church and was sentenced to 3 years of house arrest the year Anne was born. After her father's death, Anne married childhood friend and cloth merchant William Hutchinson in 1612. She began to work in Alford as a midwife and herbalist. Around the same period, Anne started teaching Bible lessons in her home with other women. The Hutchinsons became followers of Puritan minister John Cotton, who preached that God preordained that mercy but damnation is determined by earthly behavior. Anne began to vigorously spread Cotton's message to other women, with Cotton's approval, since more women would often enter his congregation after following Anne's persuasiveness. The ascent of King Charles I in 1626 led to the persecution of Protestants by the Anglican Church of England. Puritans fled in large numbers beginning in 1630. The first of these included John Winthrop, future governor of the Massachusetts colony. Cotton was questioned by the High Commission's court over concerns that his preaching about church reform caused dissent. Cotton immediately went to hiding and fled to Boston in 1633. Believing Massachusetts was in opposition to the king, British authorities closed borders, stopped emigrants from leaving under the threat of prosecution, and made threats to Massachusetts. At the age of 43 in 1634, Hutchinson and her family, which included 10 children, dodged British authorities and joined Cotton in Boston in 1634, following Anne's revelation to do so while reading the Bible. William Hutchinson rose to prominence in Boston, becoming a magistrate. At the same time, Anne joined with a group of women who worked as healers, treating illness and assisting in childbirth. Cotton immediately cemented his power in the New World and engineered the congregational structure of church worship, which Anne in his inner circle. During her involvement with the healing group, Anne developed the religious philosophy that became the focus of her American preaching. She believed that heaven was attainable to anyone who worshiped God directly through personal connection. Anne also preached that behavior, and therefore sin, did not affect whether someone went to heaven. These beliefs were in direct violation of Puritan doctrine. Anne expanded on her ideas in sermons, and people flocked to listen to her, including men. By 1636, Anne held 2 meetings a week with as many as 80 people at each meeting, including Henry Vane, the governor of Massachusetts. After a year of preaching, Anne started to receive negative attention from the Puritan leadership, believing she preached for only men and thought Anne's ideas were dangerous. Those also felt that Anne's stance against sin could promote dissension in the colony and encourage people to refuse to work and act against church and the colony rules. Those who rose in opposition to her were the re-elected Governor John Winthrop and John Cotton. They feared Anne was becoming a church separatist. Both sent female spies to hear sermons. Cotton gathered with another colony clergy to pass resolutions designed to end religious dissidence. One resolution expressly forbade meeting in Anne's home, but Anne ignored the order. In 1637, Anne, several months into her pregnancy, was called to appear before the general court, with Winthrop presiding and Cotton testifying against her. Over the next 2 days, a debate saw Anne performing well before the group of men when challenged on biblical prowess, but her final argument sealed her fate. It was a lengthy statement of her philosophy and history, an account of speaking directly with God that included with a prophecy of the ruin of the court and the colony in retribution for their persecution of Anne. The men saw this as a challenge to their authority. Anne was proclaimed a heretic. She and her family were banished from the colony, and any supporters in positions of power were removed. All supporters were forced to surrender arms. Anne remained under house arrest until winter ended. In March 1638, the Hutchinson family, along with 30 other families, left for the island of Aquidneck in Rhode Island Territory at the suggestion of Roger Williams, where they founded Portsmouth. The men of the Massachusetts colony didn't stop trying to harm Anne's reputation. After her pregnancy ended in June with a severely deformed baby's stillbirth, rumors were spread that Anne had given birth to a demon, spurred on by Winthrop. Cotton preached that the stillbirth was her punishment from God. The defamation went beyond her own labor. One minister claimed Hutchinson had never delivered a normal baby as a midwife. They were all monsters. Governor Winthrop offered physical descriptions of many babies supposedly born to Anne's followers as devil-like, clawed creatures. After William died in 1642, ministers from Massachusetts were dispatched to force Anne to renounce her beliefs and coerce her into believing that Massachusetts would soon take over the Rhode Island Territory. Wishing to escape Massachusetts meddling, Anne and her children moved to the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which is now New York City, homesteading on Long Island Sound. One afternoon in the summer of 1643, Anne's family was attacked by Native American warriors at their home. 15 people, including Anne, were axed to death. Their bodies burned. Hearing of Anne's death, John Winthrop, who had never stopped monitoring Anne's movements, expressed that his prayers had been answered and that an instrument of the devil had been dealt with justly. Even after her death, she held a grudge against her. He later wrote a hostile essay about Anne, calling her the American Jezebel. Piracy Part One. Not gonna lie, I love pirates. I loved playing with pirate Legos as a kid and watching and reading about swashbuckling adventures. As a historian, I can now see that those stories are merely that, contrived tales with little to no historical merit. But as your humble narrator will begin to fold to his internal biases, I will be covering the history of piracy more than I should. It is as a passion of mine, so back off, pal. The classic era piracy in the Caribbean lasted from 1650 until the mid-1720s. By 1650, France, England, and United Provinces began to develop their colonial empires. This involved considerable seaborne trade with a general economic improvement, money to be made or stolen, and much of it traveled by ships. French buccaneers were established on northern Hispaniola as early as 1625, but lived mostly as hunters rather than robbers. Their transition to full-time piracy was gradual and motivated in part by Spanish efforts to wipe out both the buccaneers and the prey animals on which they depended. The buccaneers' migration from Hispaniola mainland to a more defensible offshore island of Tortuga limited their resources and accelerated their piratical raids. The Tortuga buccaneer Pierre Le Grand pioneered the settlers' attacks on galleons making the return voyage to Spain. The growth of buccaneering on Tortuga was augmented by the English capture of Jamaica from Spain in 1655. The early English governors of Jamaica freely granted letters of marque to Tortuga buccaneers and their countrymen. At the same time, the growth of Port Royal provided these raiders with a far more profitable and enjoyable place to sell their booty. In 1660s, the new French governor of Tortuga similarly provided privateering commissions to his colonists and English cutthroats from Port Royal. These conditions brought Caribbean buccaneering to its zenith. A new piracy phase began in 1690s as English pirates began to look beyond the Caribbean for treasure. The fall of Britain's Stuart kings had restored the traditional enmity between Britain and France, thus ending the profitable collaboration between English Jamaica and French Tortuga. The devastation of Port Royal by an earthquake in 1692 further reduced the Caribbean's attraction by destroying the pirates' chief market for fenced plunder. Caribbean colonial governors began to discard the traditional policy of no peace beyond the line, under which it was understood that war would continue and thus letters of marque would be granted in the Caribbean regardless of peace treaties signed in Europe. Henceforth, commissions would be given only in wartime, and the limitations would be strictly enforced. Simultaneously, England's less favored colonies, including Bermuda, New York, and Rhode Island, had become cash-starved by the Navigation Acts, which restricted trade with foreign ships. Merchants and governors eager for coin were willing to overlook and even underwrite pirate voyages. One colonial official defended a pirate because he thought it, quote, very harsh to hang people that bring in gold to these provinces, end quote. Although some of these pirates operating out of the New England and the Middle colonies targeted Spain's remoter Pacific coast colonies well into the 1690s and beyond, the Indian Ocean was more decadent and more tempting target. India's economic output was large during this time, especially in high-value luxury goods like silk and calico, which made ideal pirate booty. At the same time, no powerful navies implied the Indian Ocean, leaving both local shipping and the various East India Company's vessels vulnerable to attack. This set the stage for famous pirates like William Kidd. Spanish pieces of 8 minted in Mexico or Seville were the standard trade currency in the American colonies. However, every territory still used the monetary units of pounds, shillings, and pence for bookkeeping. Simultaneously, Spanish, German, French, and Portuguese money were all standard mediums of exchange, as British law prohibited the export of British silver coinage. Until the exchange rates were standardized in the late 18th century, each colony legislated its different exchange rates. One 18th century English shilling was worth around $58 in modern currency, so a piece of 8 could be worth anywhere between $246 to $465. As such, pirate plunder's value could vary considerably, depending on who recorded it and where. Ordinary seamen received a part of the plunder at the captain's discretion, but usually a single share. On average, a pirate could expect the equivalent of a year's wages as his shares for each ship captured, while the crew of most successful pirates would often receive a claim valued of around $1.17 million at least once in their career. One of the more massive amounts taken from a single ship was Captain Thomas Tew from an Indian merchantman in 1692. On his boat, each ordinary seaman received a share worth $3.5 million, which officers received in proportionally more massive amounts as per the agreed claims, with Tew himself receiving 2.5 shares. There were actions for multiple ships captured where a single share was worth almost double this. Documented slavery. One would not think there could be nuance and semantics to the topic like slavery, but unfortunately, there is. John Punch was an enslaved African who lived in the colony of Virginia. Though an indentured servant, Punch attempted to escape to Maryland and was sentenced in July 1640 by the Virginia Governor's Council to serve as a slave for the remainder of his life. 2 European men who ran away with him received a lighter sentence and extended indentured servitude. For this reason, historians consider John Punch the, quote, first official slave in the English colonies, end quote, and his case as the first legal sanctioning of lifelong slavery in the Chesapeake. Historians also consider this to be one of the first legal distinctions between Europeans and Africans made in the colony and a key milestone in developing the institution of slavery in the United States. African slaves were first brought to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. However, their status as slaves or indentured servants remains unclear. Some historians believe that slavery may have existed from the very first arrival in 1619. Still, others think that the institution did not develop until the 1660s, and that their status until then was that of an indentured servant. Others believe that the evidence is too sketchy to permit any definitive conclusion either way. While we recognize differing opinions over when the institution of slavery started, most scholars agree that both free black people and enslaved black people were found in the Virginia colony by 1640. John Punch was the servant of a Virginia planter, Hugh Gwynn, a wealthy landowner, justice, and member of the House of Burgess, representing Charles River County. In 1640, Punch ran away to Maryland, accompanied by two of Gwynn's European indentured servants. All three were caught and returned to Virginia. On July 9, the Virginia Governor's Council, which served as the colony's highest court, sentenced both Europeans to have their indentured terms extended by another 4 years each. However, they sentenced Punch to serve his said master or his assigns for that time of his natural life here or elsewhere. Also, the council convicted the three men to 30 lashes each. Punch, in effect, became a slave under this ruling. Thus, although he committed the same crime as the Dutchman and the Scotsman, John Punch, a black man, was sentenced to a lifetime of slavery. In 1654, John Cassar, a black man who claimed to have completed his indentured term, became one of the first legally recognized slaves for life in a civil case in the Virginia colony. The court ruled with his master, who said he had an indefinite servitude for life. Cassar was initially an indentured servant, which meant he was practically a slave in some sense. What was bought or sold wasn't him. It was his contract of the indenture, which obligated him to work for its holder for the period it set. At the end of that time, indentured servants, who could be any race, were considered legally free and set out into the world. This might sound like a rough deal, but indentured was how the British colonizers who lived in that time would later become the United States managed to populate the land and get enough people to do the backbreaking work of farming crops like tobacco in the South. People who survived their indentured, and many didn't, went on to live free lives in the colonies, often after receiving small compensation like clothes, land, or tools to help them set up. It was the incentive that caused many poor whites to indenture themselves and their families and move to the so-called New World. But Africans who were indentured were often captured and brought over against their will. That's what happened to the holder of Cassar's indenture, Anthony Johnson. Johnson served out his contract and went on to run his tobacco farm and hold his indentured servants, among them Cassar. At the time, the colony of Virginia had very few black people. Johnson was one of the original 20. After disagreement about whether Cassar's contract lapsed, a court ruled in favor of Johnson. Cassar saw his indentured status turn into slavery, where he, not his agreement, was considered property. Cassar claimed that he had served his indentured of 8 years and 7 more years on top of that. The court sided with Johnson, who claimed that Cassar was his slave for life. So Cassar became the first person to be arbitrarily declared a slave for life in the U.S. Unlike the earlier case with John Punch being declared a slave for life as punishment for trying to escape his indentured servitude. The transatlantic slave from Africa to the Americas had been around for over a century already, originally about 1500s. Slaves, usually captured and sold by other African tribes, were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. Around 11 million people were transported from 1500 to 1850, mostly to Brazil and the Caribbean islands. If they arrived in America, they became indentured servants. If they became elsewhere, they became slaves. Cash's story is particularly grim in hindsight. His slip into slavery would be followed by many other African descendants who were declared the property in the United States. It was a watershed moment in the history of the institutional slavery. About 7 years later, Virginia made this practice legal for everyone. In 1661, by making it state law for any free white, black, or Indian to own slaves, along with indentured servants. The steps from where to get a radicalized idea of slavery wasn't a huge one, and by the time Johnson died in 1670, his race was used to justify giving his plantation to white men rather than Johnson's children by his wife, Mary. He was not a citizen of the colony, a judge ruled, because he was black. On July 21st, 1656, Elizabeth Key became the first woman of African descent in North America colonies to sue for freedom and win. Key was born in 1630 in Warwick County, Virginia, to an enslaved African woman. Her father was a white planter named Thomas Key. Key was baptized in the Church of England, and because she was an illegitimate child, placed her in indentured servitude. Her indenture was transferred to a justice of the peace named John Mottram. In 1650, Mottram paid for the passage of several young English indentured servants. One of them was William Grinstead. Elizabeth and William soon began a relationship. They had a son named John. John Mottram died in 1655, and his heirs designated Key as enslaved, not indentured, and asserted that she and her son belonged to Mottram's estate. Now free from his indenture and practicing law, William Grinstead represented Key and their son as he sued for their freedom from the Mottrams in court. Her case hinged on several key arguments. One was the fact that her father, Thomas Key, was English, and that according to English law, one's legal status as free or in bondage followed that of the father. Secondly, she had been indentured servitude for 10 years longer than she should have. Thomas Key had stipulated that she was to be set free when she was 15. Finally, she argued that she had been baptized as a child and was practicing Christian and could not be enslaved. She lost her case in appeals court, but petitioned the General Assembly to take a look at her case. The committee was formed to investigate, and they decided it was Elizabeth, determining that she was free based on her father's status and baptism. Elizabeth and her son won their freedom in lower courts on July 21st, 1656. Elizabeth married William Grinstead and had a second son, but William soon died after 1660. Elizabeth lived out the rest of her freedom in her life with her two sons. Her victory came at a formative moment in the colonial Virginia, as the very concept of whiteness was emerging as a means of reinforcing existing power structures. Through the law, white planters were elite and were regulating and defining slavery through blackness. Laws that gave Key her freedom were thrown out in the 1700s by white men who wanted to design a racialized society. To bind these ties together, the white planters acted through the Virginia legislature. In 1667, 11 years after the General Assembly played a crucial part in Elizabeth's victory, the same legislative body passed a bill declaring that the conferring of baptism does not alter the conditions of the person to his bondage or freedom. The passage of this law was inspired by appeals from freedoms like Elizabeth's, where enslaved or indentured individuals used their status as Christians to argue that they could not be held in lifelong bondage. During the colonial era, the system of racialized chattels slavery that, in the following centuries, was justified as an eternal and biologically based hierarchy, was only beginning to take shape. Slavery, as a system in the United States, is often studied at its most rigid and fixed. Cases like Elizabeth Key's helps highlight how justifications for discriminatory practices were built over time, and the fluidity of status and freedom for African descent people in early colonial Virginia. She initially lost her case because she and her son were classified by the courts as Negroes, but was able to win by highlighting her father's whiteness and her Christian faith. Beaver Wars. Honestly, the term Beaver Wars seems like a missed opportunity for my basal middle school age sense of humor. I mostly conjure up images of beavers with lightsabers. The wars were prompted in no small measure by the growing scarcity of the beavers in the lands controlled by the Iroquois in the mid-17th century. At the time of the conflict, the Iroquois inhabited a region of present-day New York south of Lake Ontario and west of the Hudson River. The Iroquois lands comprised an ethnic island surrounded by Algonquin-speaking tribes, including the Shawnee, to the west in the Ohio Country, and the Iroquoian-speaking Huron on the north along a St. Lawrence River. They were not part of the Iroquois Confederation. With the establishment of Dutch trading posts in the Hudson in the 1620s, the Iroquois, particularly the Mohawk, had come to rely on trade for the purchase of firearms and other European goods. However, the introduction of weapons had accelerated the decline of the beaver's population, such that by 1640 the animal had largely disappeared from the Hudson Valley. The center of the fur trade thus shifted northward toward the colder regions along the St. Lawrence River, controlled by the Hurons, who were the close trading partners of the French in New France. The Iroquois, who considered themselves the most civilized and advanced people of the region, found themselves displaced by the fur trade by other tribes. Threatened by disease and with a declining population, the Iroquois began an aggressive campaign to expand its control area. Relations between the Iroquois and the French were not harmonious in the early 17th century. The first encounter was in 1609, when Samuel de Champlain, in the company of his Algonquin allies, killed 3 Iroquois chiefs with an arquebus on the shores of Lake Champlain. By 1640s, however, the Iroquois had become fully armed with European weaponry through their trade with the Dutch and were ready to match the French and their Algonquin allies' strength. Although the war's initial intent was not to exterminate the French, but rather to assume the role of middleman in the fur trade, the Iroquois conflict with the French allies quickly brought them into a fierce and bloody conflict with the Europeans themselves. The war began in the early 1640s with Iroquois attacks on Huron villages along the St. Lawrence to disrupt the Huron trade with the French. By 1649, the Iroquois had driven the Huron from the lower St. Lawrence into regions farther north, leaving the Ottawa to fill the fur trade vacuum with the French. In the early 1650s, the Iroquois began attacking the French themselves, although some of the Iroquois tribes, notably the Onondaga and the Onondaga, had peaceful relations with the French but were under the Mohawks' control. The latter were the strongest tribe in the Confederation and had animosity towards the French presence. After a failed peace treaty, Iroquois war parties moved north into New France along the Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River, attacking and blockading Montreal. Typically, a raid on an isolated farm or settlement consisted of a war party moving swiftly and silently through the woods, swooping down suddenly, wielding tomahawks and scalping knife to slaughter all the inhabitants. In some cases, prisoners were carried back to the Iroquois homelands. In the case of women and children, such prisoners were sometimes to be incorporated into the tribe. In the case of men, the prisoners were often subjected to a slow death by torture. Although such raids were by no means constant, when they occurred, they were bone-chilling to the inhabitants of New France, and the colonists initially felt helpless to prevent them. Some of the heroes of the French-Canadian folk memory are individuals who stood up to such attacks, such as Dollard des Ormeaux, who died in May 1660 while resisting an Iroquois trading force along the Long Sault at the confluence of the St. Lawrence and the Ottawa rivers. He succeeded in saving Montreal by his sacrifice. While the Iroquois were attacking northward, they also began a significant expansion into the west along the Great Lakes. By 1650, they controlled North America's region extending from the Virginia colony in the south up to the St. Lawrence. In the west, the Iroquois had driven the Algonquin-speaking Shawnee out of the Ohio country and seized control of the Illinois country as far west as the Mississippi River. As a result of Iroquois expansion, eastern tribes such as the Lakota were pushed across the Mississippi onto the Great Lakes, adopting the nomadic lifestyle that later became well known. Other refugees flooded the Great Lakes area, resulting in a conflict with existing tribes in the region. The tide of war began to turn in the middle 1660s with the arrival of a small contingent of regular troops from France. The first group of uniformed professional soldiers to set foot on what is today Canadian soil. Simultaneously, the Dutch allies of the Iroquois lost control of the New Netherlands colony to the English in the south. In January 1666, the French invaded the Iroquois homeland. Although the invasion was abortive, they took their chief as a prisoner. In September, they proceeded down the river and marched through Iroquois territory a second time. Unable to find an Iroquois army, they resorted to burning their crops and homes. Many Iroquois died from starvation the following winter. The Iroquois sued for peace, which lasted a generation. In the meantime, many of the French regiments stayed on in the colony as settlers, significantly altering the colonial landscape. After all, they were hardened veteran soldiers who had fought the Turks before coming to Canada. They were rough in manner and speech, and any hope of that local churchmen might have had of fostering a peaceful society on the banks of the St. Lawrence evaporated. After the departure of the French regiment in 1667, with the Iroquois temporarily pacified, the colony's administrators at last took steps to form an effective militia organization. Now all men in the settlement between the ages of 16 and 65 were issued a musket and ammunition and became liable for military service. The war between the French and Iroquois resumed in 1683, after the governor attempted to enrich his fortune by pursuing the western fur trade with a new aggressiveness, which adversely affected the growing activities of the Iroquois in the area. This time the war lasted 10 years and was bloody as the first. Finally, in 1698, increasingly seeing themselves as the convenient scapegoat in what was essentially an English-inspired war, the Iroquois sued for peace, ending the wars. The French, meanwhile, were eager to have their Iroquois as a bulwark between New France and the English in the south. The signing of the 1701 Great Peace in Montreal by 39 Indian chiefs, the French and the English. In the treaty, the Iroquois agreed to stop marauding and allow refugees from the Great Lakes to return east. The Shawnee eventually regained control of the Ohio country and the lower Allegheny River. At last, the Shawnee were at peace. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.